Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. Today's lesson 2.3, if you're following at home, is on the back of the outline that you were provided earlier. What we're doing today, though, is continuing the key concept on urban civilization and its consequence, but we're going to take a little bit different approach than we did last time. We're going to sort of mix a spatial approach, looking at different regions, with a chronological approach. So, what we're looking at are the four core civilizations. This is according to the College Board. Now, I should point out there's some evidence that there's other civilizations early on in Afro-Eurasia. They may not have had the lasting impact that these four do, but it is worth noting they're not the only ones that may or may not meet the definition of a civilization. But we're going to do them by region, but also by chronology. So if you would make a note of that out in the margin for Roman numeral 4, it's chronological order by region. So we're kind of combining those, beginning with Mesopotamia, then the Nile Valley, Indus River, and the Yellow River. Before we get into that, though, I want to draw your attention to a focus question that you might notice is a little different. To what extent did the core civilizations meet the five features? This is a verb, evaluate. We've talked about this briefly in class, but this is by far the hardest of all of the verbs where are for tasks that you're going to be required to do. To what extent? How much do they meet these five features? So let's go ahead and dive in. Look at the four regions in chronological order for the core civilizations of Afro-Eurasia, beginning with Mesopotamia. The word Mesopotamia means land between the rivers. The two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. But I need you to understand, when we talk about Mesopotamian civilization, we're talking about the people that live in Mesopotamia, because they're not all the same people. There's a bunch of different peoples, plural, living in this area at different times. The first of which are Sumerians. They're the ones that invent all of this civilization. But as we'll see, there's waves of migrants coming in, including these people called Semites and Indo-Europeans, and they just copy everything that the Sumerians did. So their civilization is essentially the same, even though the people are not. Now, the way the Mesopotamian civilizations live are in very large cities, the earliest, and there's many, many, many of them. But politically, there's something unique. They're organized as city states. And this is a concept we'll get into more next week. But a city state is kind of a hard thing for us to grasp. Every city is like what we would call a different country. So if I live in one city, you live in another city, even though we speak the same language, we worship the same gods, many of our traditions are exactly the same, I would consider you a foreigner. Why? Because we practice the city-state system. My city is its own independent state. Yours is too, and we're not the same. In terms of social hierarchy, another feature of civilization, the social hierarchy in Mesopotamia has many different layers of stratification, and they are very strictly enforced. As we have seen, Hammurabi, the first law, occurs in Mesopotamia. It's encoded into law, the differences between the different social classes. In terms of public works, there is definitely extensive irrigation. That requires a whole lot of labor. People working, doing stuff that isn't fun, they don't necessarily want to do. Palaces and tombs as well. The difference there, though, is remember, irrigation is a form of infrastructure. That benefits everybody. Why? Because it leads to more food. Palaces and tombs benefit the kings that are living in palaces or buried in tombs. It's monumental architecture. Ziggurats, though, are a kind of unusual feature. They're these structures that exist in every Mesopotamian city. They're kind of like step pyramids, but while they're a form of monumental architecture, they require a great deal of labor to build, and they definitely show off the power of the king who built them. There's also this aspect of infrastructure because all of the people worship there. But notice something about how they're organized because it also replicates a social hierarchy. Only the priest and the king is allowed at the very top, and then other priests might be allowed below, and everybody else is down on the ground level around it. Nonetheless, everybody is there worshiping, which you could argue is a benefit for everybody. In terms of writing, the earliest evidence of writing we have comes from Mesopotamia in the form of cuneiform. That is a Latin word that means wedge shaped. And it has to do with the fact that their writing system developed by cutting these plants that live along rivers called reeds. You cut them horizontally, and when you do, it makes a triangle and you press it into clay. The wedge-shaped writing develops over time. It was initially developed to record transactions, trade, but also and especially taxes. Later on, people realized that you could modify that, you could change it, and you could record other things, including things like stories, including things like histories, including things like beliefs. And so this is how writing develops. A unique feature of Mesopotamia, though, is the relationship between geography and their belief about the afterlife. The Tigris and Euphrates flood, and that flooding brings nutrients to the soil, which allows for the domestication of plants. However, those floods are very unpredictable. The storms, they never know when they're coming. One consequence of this can be seen in their view of the afterlife. In the afterlife for Mesopotamians, everyone who dies goes to the underworld. The underworld is not hell, it's just the place where people go when they die. There, their bodies are clay and they eat and drink dust, and it's kind of this dark, shadowy existence. Why? Well, because to them, when they're alive, nature is very unpredictable. It provides life, but it also includes death because that unpredictability means that some people are going to die. Chronologically, the next region where civilization appears is in the Nile Valley, what most people think of as Egypt. Now, there's a geographic note I want to make here, the distinction between Upper and Lower Egypt. It has to do with the altitude and not with direction. Lower Egypt is actually north. Upper Egypt is south. Both of them are along the Nile. Upper Egypt, which is south, is higher altitude. The elevation's higher, which is why the Nile flows from south to north into the Mediterranean. Lower Egypt, while it's north, is actually at sea level, and that's why it sort of fans out into this web of uh, little riverlets. Another distinction to make has to do with their political system and also with their periodization. Traditionally, Egyptian civilization is divided into three kingdoms. However, they're not really different kingdoms. It's the same area, they're just three different dynasties. But those dynasties last for thousands of years. So when you hear the, Middle Kingdom, for example, it's not a new kingdom, it's just a new dynasty, but it's a dynasty that lasts for a long, long time. Dynasties meaning a family line of rulers, in the case of Egypt, the pharaoh. Now, compared to Mesopotamia, they do have cities, but they have far fewer big cities than Mesopotamia does. Politically, though, it's a little different because Pharaoh, the king who's worshipped as a god, rules all of it. So you can think of it as one giant kingdom. Whereas a city state system is every city is a kingdom that's independent of other cities, which are also kingdoms. It's one giant kingdom, and Pharaoh is at the top. Their social hierarchy, though, is very, very similar. There is definitely a bureaucracy of priests and scribes, and all of that will eventually become codified into law, just as it is in Mesopotamia. Similarly, in terms of public works, there's extensive irrigation in the Nile Valley, palaces and tombs. I suspect you've probably seen that. But there is one difference in architecture with the pyramids. Everybody has probably seen an image of the pyramids. Obviously, that takes a great amount of labor to build. It's a public work. What's different about the pyramids compared to the ziggurats, though, is the pyramids are solely monumental architecture. They have no other purpose that could be considered infrastructure. People don't go to the pyramids to worship. The purpose of the pyramids is to demonstrate how great the pharaoh who commissioned it is. In fact, they thought of it was a kind of machine that launched his soul into the heavens to make him a god. So it's a similar structure, but a slightly different purpose. The Egyptians also had a writing system you've probably heard of, hieroglyphs. Now, hieroglyph is a Greek word that means sacred writing because the Greeks, when they saw it, saw this writing on all the tombs and palaces that were commissioned by the pharaohs. But they also had another type of script called Demotic. You can think of it as a kind of cursive form of hieroglyphs that was used primarily for recording transactions. This is a very interesting image to me. These are hieroglyphs, you've seen those, and you can also tell they're written in columns. There's something unusual about the writing system, though. You could do hieroglyphic writing in any direction, and you can go back and forth. You can do a circle. You can do it all any way you want. This is in columns. You can tell by the lines. But look at the animal images and the direction they're facing. I hope that I have time in class to describe to you how you can tell the direction of hieroglyphic writing because it's the opposite of what we think it is. And it has something very unusual to say about the culture of the ancient Egyptians. That leads me then to the connection between geography and culture. The Nile Valley floods very predictably. They knew exactly when it was going to flood. And when it flooded, they could prepare, and it was nothing but good. A consequence of that can be seen in their depiction of the afterlife. They believed that after you died, you would have a series of tests. And if you passed those tests, you would live in this kind of eternal paradise. Everything would be great. You'd live on milk and honey. There would be, plenty of your friends and family who passed. It would be awesome. Very different view that can be tied to the geographical conditions compared to the Mesopotamians. The third core civilization chronologically is found in the Indus Valley in South Asia. Now, this is the area that is now India and Pakistan. India, as you'll see, isn't a thing until very, very recently. I will use that. It's an easy way to describe where we're talking about. South Asia is really where it is. Now, the Indus Valley civilization, they had many, many big cities, some of the earliest cities. They also had city states. Every city was like its own independent state. But one thing that's unusual about them is all of the cities are built and constructed with the exact same plan. In other words, there appears to have been this system that for some reason everybody replicated. All the cities are built in the exact same way, even though they are considered separate states. That's very unusual. Another unusual thing is they do have a social hierarchy, but it's not as many layers. There's basically two layers: the priests at the top and everybody else at the bottom. And this is kind of egalitarian, but politically, the priests are also acting as the bureaucrats. It appears the priests are the ones who are running the city. The egalitarianism part, though, is that well, in several things. I'm going to come back to one in just a moment. But like the people who are not priests all seem to live the same. And the priests don't live that differently than everybody else. Here is a piece of sculpture from the Indus Valley civilization of a priest. One of the things I want you to notice about this, though, is his face. If this priest is a leader of their political system, he does not appear to be like ruling by force. He's not angry, he's not threatening. In fact, if anything, it kind of appears like he's half asleep, like he's meditating or something. So there's something unusual about that. In terms of public works, they definitely had irrigation that benefits everybody. But another thing that's unique about them is they have the earliest record we have of indoor plumbing. They had a sewer system where liquid waste could be flushed away. Like, that benefits everybody, and it requires a labor force, and somehow they did it. Public baths are also found throughout all of their cities. Bathing was apparently a very important ritual to them, so much so that they made it available to everybody. And there's no evidence of monumental architecture. Nothing that was built by the Indus Valley civilization seems to like glorify the individual power of a particular person or family. They had a writing script system, the Indus Valley script. What's unique about it is that it's never been deciphered. Now, I need you to make a note of deciphered here. That means we cannot read it. Deciphered means we don't understand it. They understood it. They understood it perfectly. To us, we can't read what they wrote. They had a system of writing that can be seen in this image called cylinder seals. Okay, here's how this works. If you look at the top of this image, you'll see some letters or something like it, symbols. That's their writing system, Indus Valley script, which we can't read, they could. But if you look closely at it, you'll see that there's the dark spots. This is on a piece of copper, and the letters are knocked into the copper. But if you look below, you'll see there's an image of a bull, and it's knocked out towards us. And the cylinder seal was made on a piece of copper, and then you fold it into a cylinder, a kind of circle, and then you roll that cylinder on clay. It was an early kind of receipt. Okay, you got this stamp, if you will, like, my stamp is kind of like my official seal of Paponia. I don't know what that says. No one knows what that. I like to think that it says something like, "Hey, I traded a bull for something something." Roll it on a piece of clay, receipt. There you go. Now, an interesting question unique to the Indus Valley civilization, though, is why do they kind of apparently disappear? We know that climate change is a part of it. There's a change in the monsoon patterns that make the flooding of the Indus Valley change. That affects food production. We also know that there's this migration of people called the Aryans that we'll talk about in a couple of days. Some people have suggested that the Aryans, these Indo-Europeans who move into the Indus Valley, like take over and conquer the Indus Valley civilization. There's no clear answer on this, but here's what I would suggest. Definitely climate change was an issue. The Indus Valley civilization was struggling to produce food at the time, at the exact same time that the Aryans show up. But what most historians and scholars studying the question think now is it was actually a mixture of the Aryan peoples and the indigenous people, the Indus Valley people. But this is an issue we'll get into later on. Fourth and finally, in terms of chronological order, is the Yellow Valley civilization in East Asia. This is the region that's now known as China. Again, just like India, it's not a thing, although it's going to be a thing very quickly. East Asia is technically more correct. One thing to know about this, though, is why is it called the Yellow Valley? It has nothing to do with the people. It's because there's this stuff called loess. Loess is created by the Himalaya mountains, and the monsoon winds, as we'll see later on, are really strong and carry across the Himalayas from the south. As they do, they grind the rock from the Himalayas into dust, a superfine dust, jet it up into the atmosphere, and then it all sinks back at the Wanghe, the Yellow River. That turns the river literally yellow. But all of that dust is also mineral rich nutrients. So when the Yellow River floods, it fertilizes the soil around it. Consequently, it's great for growing food. But there's something unique about the Yellow Valley civilization, both in terms of their society and their politics. They practice feudalism. Now, we'll get into this more in a later unit, but for right now, feudalism involves exchanging land for loyalty. So they have a king, and there's three dynasties. The Xia, which the tradition in China says is the first dynasty. The actual physical evidence for it is tough to come by. But the Shang and the Zhou dynasty, we definitely have solid evidence for. These dynasties of kingdoms, the king would give land to lords who would then manage the land, give it to other people in exchange for loyalty. So, a consequence of this politically is it's very decentralized. There is no real bureaucratic system because it's just expected. I gave you land, you have to be loyal to me. The other thing about it is that is essentially then replicated in a social hierarchy. It's not so much about class as it is who has land and who doesn't. In terms of urbanization, they did not have many big cities at all. They had a whole lot of agricultural villages. They didn't have many big cities. In fact, maybe only one or two, including a city that was a capital. But compared to the other core civilizations, far less urbanization. In terms of public works, there's definitely evidence of irrigation and flood control, which required a huge labor force to create. They have evidence of palaces, glorifying obviously the king and probably the lords as well. But there is no other monumental architecture to speak of. So that also, you see how that compares to the other core civilizations. They did have a writing system, but there's something very unique about it. It did not stem initially from recording transactions. It stems from something called oracle bones. Technically, they're not bones, as we'll see, but the word oracle means telling the future. Okay, here's how this works. The earliest Chinese characters were symbols carved on usually a tortoise shell. Somebody would ask a question and the tortoise shell would be thrown into a fire, and the fire would make the shell crack, and wherever the crack fell, whichever characters they hit would be your answer. It's sort of like if you've ever seen one of those magic 8 balls. You ask a question, shake it up, and gravity makes something come up to the top. Now, you can see all sorts of symbols on here, but I'm going to simplify it. Let's say, for example, I'm the king and I want to know, should I go to war against so and so? And then you carve on a shell, yes, the symbol for yes, the symbol for no. And then you throw it in a fire. Well, if the crack goes towards no, then I would interpret that as a sign, no, you don't go to war. If it cracks towards the yes, that's basically how the oracle bones worked. But again, people would very quickly figure out, hey, I can use those symbols for other things, and it becomes a full-fledged writing system. The last thing I want to note about the 4 core civilizations, which again, I've gone by region, but I've also gone in chronological order. Let's look at their contact with each other and how geography affects that. All of the core civilizations traded with the pastoralists around them. Remember, pastoralists have domesticated animals, but where they live, they cannot domesticate plants. So they have to move around to find grass. So they all traded with pastoralists. But China was the only early one, the Yellow Valley civilization, that had no contact with the other civilizations. Let's look at why. This is a topographic map of Afro-Eurasia, okay? Here's the Yellow River Valley, the Wanghe, where the Chinese civilization emerges. Here's the Indus Valley. Here's the Nile Valley. Here's Mesopotamia. So that's in reverse chronological order, okay? Now, we know that the Nile Valley civilization traded with Mesopotamian civilizations. How do we know? Because they both had writing and recorded it, and we can read it. We also know that the Indus Valley civilization traded with Mesopotamia. How do we know that if we can't read their writing? It's undeciphered to us. The answer is because they left some of their cylinder seals in Mesopotamia. In other words, it appears like merchants were there trading, and I don't know, maybe it just got worn out, they lost it, whatever, left it, it gets buried. We have evidence, though, there were people from the Indus Valley civilization. Even though we can't read their writing, it's their writing. Now look at the Yellow River civilization. They're completely cut off. Why? The Himalaya Mountains. The Himalayas are a blessing and a curse for them. On the one hand, it provides the lowest that gives great soil for growing crops, but on the other hand, it cuts them off from the other ones. This may or may not have consequences, as we'll see in class. So again, the focus question, to what extent do they meet the 5 features? Another way of thinking about that is how civilized were they? That's the focus of the activity we're doing in class tomorrow. In the meantime, please be able to answer the following questions. What are the 4 core civilizations in chronological order? It's on your outline, but like without looking at it, could you put them in order? Which one was connected to the most other core civilizations, and which one had no contact with the others? Finally, there's 5 features of civilizations, okay? But as you'll see in class tomorrow, you're going to get a spiced tea chart on these civilizations. There's 6 themes, right? Spiced tea. One of the questions you're going to have to deal with in class tomorrow is, where do you think the 5 features would be found on a spiced tea chart? Think about that one. You're probably not going to have an answer, but be aware that's something that's going to come in class. Man, I tried to get under a half hour. I'm just about there. If you hung with me, I appreciate your attention. If you filled out the outline and annotated, make sure you get a stamp. You will notice there's a little bit left at the bottom. That'll be the something we start with for tomorrow's lesson. Thank you for your attention. You guys are awesome. You're doing a great job. Can't wait to see you in class.